Fun fact, there are people out there who genuinely believe that Europeans came into Africa and forcefully enslaved us. Well, if you're one of those people, I hate to break it to you, but that is not entirely true. Here is how it all really happened. You see, the transatlantic slave trade, the Middle Passage, and everything in between was all part of a larger scheme known as the Triangular Trade. This trade began in the early 16th century and ended in the mid 19th century. And the most basic definition of this trade can be put as the commercial movement from Europe to Africa, from Africa to America, from America back to Europe. And this movement formed a triangle across the Atlantic Ocean, hence the name triangular trade. And if you're curious enough, you might be wondering, how did this even become a thing? Let me break it down for you. The continents of South America and North America you're hearing about today wasn't even discovered until 500 years ago by a navigator called Christopher Columbus. With this newly found continent, Europe, as usual, saw this as an opportunity for economic exploitation and territorial expansion, leading to the rapid development of the Americas, which then led to the high demand for cheap labor, hence the transatlantic slave trade. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's dive into the cruciality of this in the triangular trade. The best way to put it is that this trade was a three-legged trade route market, and it had three main stages. Now, the first stage started with Europe. This stage involved the manufacturing and processing of raw materials, and then preparation for shipment to Africa. And some of these finished goods involve ammunition, guns, textile, beverages, alcohol, rum, brass plates, etc. When these goods arrive in Africa through the West African coast, they are then being exchanged for slaves. Mind you, majority of slaves were actually taken from West Central Africa, which technically means majority of Africans in diaspora can trace their roots back to West Central Africa, which means you probably have a distance cousin over there. Now, the second stage of the triangular trade, as we could presume, is the transatlantic slave trade. Now, the transatlantic slave trade was dominated by four major countries: Portugal, Spain, Britain, and France. Every other country that participated in the transatlantic slave trade did not measure up to these four countries. These were the Oga Patapata of slave trade. They were at the top, they were controlling majority of the ships, the boats, everything. And the number one country to dominate the transatlantic slave trade for the first 150 years was Portugal. But after the first century of the transatlantic slave trade, the United Kingdom of Great Britain took over. And did you know that 7 out of 10 transatlantic slave trade voyages came from Britain and from Portugal? At this very length, West Central Africa supplied 9 out of 10 Africans to the America for slave trade. This technically means that 9 out of 10 Africans were doomed for slavery. And the reason why Europeans had the boldness to come into Africa and demand for slaves to transport to the Americas was because we had leaders who were willing to sell their own people. And not just the leaders, we also had warlords and private kidnappers, aka the middlemen. And most slaves were captives from war and conquered territories. And the process of shipping these slaves across the Atlantic Ocean to the America is known as the Middle Passage, which I provided sufficient coverage on in my previous video, so go watch it if you haven't seen it yet. And like I mentioned in my previous video, the journey across the Atlantic usually lasted between 2 to 3 months, and on very, very terrible weather, it lasted up to 4 months. And when it reached the shores of Brazil or the Caribbean, they are then sold and auctioned to all parts of the continent of America, where they are now forced to work in plantations. Now, the third and final stage was when these raw materials that had been gotten from plantations where these slaves worked, typically on British colony soil, was now shipped to Europe, where they will now be transformed and processed into manufactured goods and then shipped back to the America as payment or as a means of exchange for the raw materials. And then the European government sent some of these manufactured goods to Africa in exchange for slaves that would now be taken to the Americas to work. And that was how the vicious cycle of the triangular trade continued for centuries and centuries until it was abolished in 1807 by the British. I genuinely hope this video was helpful and that you learned 1 or 2 things from it. And I hope to see you on my next video, so hit the subscribe button and I'll see you.